Great, great. Well, thank you everybody for attending this second week of the ICAR annual meeting, and we're thrilled that people could make it virtually for our day 3 agenda. And I hope that after this session, people will also be able to attend some of the breakout sessions. This morning, we have a really thrilling keynote for a variety of reasons. The first and foremost is that we are in unprecedented times. I mean, we face a crisis with the pandemic and economic conditions around the world that we haven't seen in 100 years. And what we know is that throughout the last century and even longer, there is no social change without a trade union movement. And the trade union movement has been at the forefront of crises and change and opportunity since the colonial era, basically. And so this morning, we're thrilled to have Sharan Burrow as the Secretary General of the International Trade Union Confederation give our keynote address, to give the perspectives of the trade union movement as well as her own, because hers is quite unique. She is the first woman to serve as both president and now Secretary General of ITUC ever. And she has been in the Secretary General's role for a little over a decade now, I mean, June 2010. So her perspectives and her profile and her prominence at driving labor and human rights issues in the corporate sector and more generally are invaluable. And with that, I would just like to say hello to her, thank her for coming, and really turn it over to her, because in this period, having the perspective of a leading trade unionist is invaluable as we think about how we deal with issues of corporate accountability, inequality, and addressing the pandemic and the economic circumstances of it. So with that, I will turn it over to Sharan to begin, and then we will go to a Q&A session for about, I think we'll have approximately 45 or so minutes or a little bit more for questions and answers. So Sharan, over to you.
Well, thank you. And I'm honored to be with you. Just let me keep track of time here, but because I really want to do the questions and answers. So I'm really happy to be with you. We couldn't be at a more difficult time with a more vulnerable foundation. That's the reality of it. Before COVID-19, we already had a convergence of crisis. We had historic inequality. It was income, but it was also race and gender. People were feeling excluded, they were feeling insecure. So we saw an age of anger emerging, and you had seen people on the streets all around the world. Chile, in the US, of course, with the Me Too movement and the Black Lives Matter movement, but around the rest of the world on jobs and income security. But that age of anger has now become an age of incredible despair, because if you marry inequality with the climate emergency, which our leaders have tried to deny and to divide people for too long, this is a crisis we can't avoid. It's about our very own survival. So it's an extinction crisis. And yes, you can believe the science or not, but if you don't believe the science, it's not going to make it go away. And this affects lives and livelihoods today, not in the future, today. We see the impact of extreme weather events. We are dealing with economic shocks. We didn't really recover from 2008, 2009 to the extent where we had full employment and living wages and social protection back as a resilient base. And then the loss of land and livelihoods from climate devastation on top of that. That was a world we were dealing with. And as a consequence of that, we were dealing with the breakdown in the employment market around the world in terms of permanent jobs. But then with COVID-19, what's happened, it began as a health crisis, and we're living through an incredible historic moment where people have given up their freedoms and indeed risked livelihoods to save lives. And that's as it should be. We support that, just as we're fighting with business for universal access to vaccine. We can't have vaccines just for the rich. Otherwise, our world will be even more vulnerable and, of course, more unjust. But it's way beyond a health crisis, because the global economic impact has taken those fractures and laid them open. They're now craters in our global economy, in our lives, everywhere. And so we need to now look at, why did the social contract break down? Why do we need a new one? We need a new social contract because, frankly, the one that we were dependent on post-World War I, II, and the Great Depression was, while it was a social contract largely for developed economies, nevertheless, it was the foundations of a global floor of rights, human rights, labor rights, and what should have been the building blocks of social justice. But what we now see is that we got to the 80s and the explosion of hyperglobalization actually started to break down the social contract. Why? Because the business model was based on business at any cost. And if you have legislative guarantees that the shareholder fiduciary responsibilities underpin all economic ambition as a first priority, then you ignore, in fact, a mandate for employment, you ignore labor rights, you work against freedom of association that you've seen in the US so dramatically through most corporations, and you break down permanent work, you break down secure work. So if you look at it now, the best explanation is that if you think we have around 3 billion or so in the global workforce, 40% of those people only are in permanent or contract related jobs. And of those, a third of those people are actually very insecure jobs, from 0 hours contract to short-term contracts to indeed exploitation on a range of indicators. But if you then go to the other 60%, they're in informal work. They have no rule of law because they have no labor rights, no minimum wage, no social protection. If you don't earn money every day, there is no chance of survival. 60% and growing. And it's not just developing countries and a model of development that's been constrained by the dominance of that economic model of the North. It's actually been about its explosion of business models, even in our own countries. So, you know, platform businesses, internet mediated businesses, these are a very good description. And when you think about professions, we would have thought, let alone occupations, but professions like journalism or accountability, accounting or legal, which are now being at its base undermined by algorithms, then in fact this internet mediated future has some opportunities, but it has a lot of costs unless we learn how to together work out what the best way to regulate all areas of business is. So we are in an unprecedented time. And as I said, even if you go back to the Great Depression, then you couldn't have predicted that this virus the pandemic would impact at a time when we were so vulnerable. Even companies are incredibly vulnerable because that shareholder profit first, or profit at any cost, has actually undermined the resilience of business. When we saw that businesses, huge global names, couldn't pay couldn't pay existing orders, fulfill contracts for existing product in their supply chains, let alone forward orders to give people some security, then we were shocked. But what it showed was that in those first few months, global business didn't even have 3 months of operating resilience. So 3 months of operating expenses. So we have to look at what is the sustainable business model for the future. And it can't be business as usual. So in that context, we are calling for a new social contract. We're saying that we need a new social contract for recovery, but also for resilience. because we can't have the same development model for the future. It's not just a question of building back. We have to actually construct a future that has a resilience foundation for everybody. It's pretty simple, really. We need jobs, jobs, and jobs, climate-friendly jobs, because we are now joined at the hip where we have to climate and employment-proof our future. That's painful. It's really painful for trade unions because many of our strong trade unions are in the fossil fuel industry. But if we're to stabilize the planet, and we only have till 2030, and get to a net zero economy that gives the planet a fighting chance to stabilize for the sustainability of human life itself, then we need to build a very different economy. Every sector has to transition. Every industry, every sector. And we need that to be a just transition, because unions need to be at the table to, first of all, secure the pensions of older workers, to make sure there are bridges to pensions if that's what those workers who haven't reached that age yet desire, or that the income support, the skills training and redeployment support are available. So if we don't do those negotiations and trying to convince the oil and gas industries that we have to move their companies to indeed sustainable, renewable energy, so that the energy sector has a capacity to serve our economies, but on a clean base, then many more jobs are at risk. But there are other technologies as well. How do we build circular economies? How do we capture not just carbon, but heat, and reuse it in other products, so that even within industries you have circularity? But in cities, which is the great hope, by the way, of both constructing jobs and indeed becoming living cities or livable cities, then we need to make sure that a circular economy is beyond just the industry, but is actually in everything we do. So if you can't reuse or redeploy products, then we have to think about whether or not we should be using them at all. And that's a tough call, because people's living standards are built on an existing base. Now, we can maintain those living standards. We can provide living standards that are achievable for those people still seeking development in developed countries, but we have to have a much greater solidarity, and a solidarity between business and labor that can make the difference, because together social dialogue works. But if we resolve the issues together, we can convince people that there is hope for the future. If we don't resolve those issues, then what you see is the aggressive contestation that we've got in our societies today, because of insecurity, because of exclusion, because of the vulnerability of business itself. Indeed, it's interesting that it's, of course, 100 years since that incredible speech made by Milton Friedman about the free economy, the free market. But today's market is actually underpinned by so much of government resources, and that's taxpayers' money. And yet you still see fights against new taxes, digital taxes, against the big tech companies that are actually undermining our mainstream businesses, if you like, Main Street businesses, but also escaping national law. So we need to look again at how we deal with wealth and wealth distribution, and how we deal with shared taxation from major global corporations that add to the tax base for us to build that resilience. So beyond jobs, climate-friendly jobs, we actually need social protection, universal social protection. Good for business because it includes self-employed, and good for workers, obviously. But again, when you think that those 1.6 billion of the 2 billion informal workers, they face destitution right now, every day. No money, no survival. And then in addition to that, you've got countries like the US and others where there's not a universal social protection base, because most of the benefits have come from the business contract, and that's why unions have been so essential to societies. Nevertheless, we need to look anew and say, what is it that will secure social protection, the resilience for the future, and a new development model? Because not only good for workers and their families, it actually builds a basic economy, and that sustains bigger ambitions within an economic environment as well. We also need to work together on some of the resilience matters. And on the employment question, on a transformative agenda for women, because of exclusion, and women's progress has stalled on every indicator you can think of, for just transition and for both climate and technology, and for those vital public services and how we fund them, we need a new social contract. But at the heart of that is a labour protection floor for all workers. That means fundamental rights respected, occupational health and safety. Indeed, we want it to be a fundamental right. That's our global struggle at the moment, and COVID-19 has exposed dramatically the situation for exposure of workers, both as guarantees against their own risk at work, but also spreading the pandemic. So, and then we need living wages, minimum living wages on which you can live. And with that, of course, you share prosperity from collective bargaining more fulsomely on top. And we need maximum hours of work, but we need that to be married with universal social protection, particularly for income and for health access, that gives us that basic security and economy. But beyond that, business and labour are working together on other things. We have a commitment with the International Chamber of Commerce, where we have demanded debt relief for the poorest countries be extended. That's about support for business, but also about support for workers. And the continuity of business is linked very clearly to jobs continuity. We have a commitment indeed to universal vaccine, as I said, which means we should share vaccines, not make them, again, a race for the wealthy to be protected first. In fact, the frontline workers, both in our health systems and those in our retail and manufacturing and transport systems, and of course the elderly, should be the first people that are provided with protection. But how do we get here? It means trust. It means we have to rebuild trust in our democracy, because if I told you the figures in our recent polls show that 2/3 of people believe that they simply have no say for government in the shape of economy, no impact on the economy, and only 1/3 of people actually are really confident about their place in our democracies, that their voice is being listened to. That's pretty shocking, because if we don't have democracy, and you're seeing it played out in the US right now with a contestation about even who votes. So universal suffrage is not even taken for granted anymore, let alone ease of access to voting and those other issues. It means we must have trust in business. And the only way we can rebuild trust in democracy and in business is if we do have social dialogue. Tripartitism is a well-established concept through the ILO in most countries where labour laws actually respect that. But in some countries, it doesn't exist still. But if you don't have a confidence in the issues that are being negotiated, if you don't have people who are in confrontation ultimately be able to sit at the table, whether it's peace, conflict, labour laws, climate solutions, just transition, whatever it is, then we will not have a future that people can trust. So we've got a lot of work to do. For us, the new social contract is about rebuilding jobs, jobs and jobs, climate-friendly jobs, universal social protection, inclusion of women and marginalised groups, whether it's race or whether it's Indigenous people or young people or whoever it might be, and of course just transition, not just for climate but for technology. We want to see some of the issues around big tech companies addressed. Break up the big tech companies. Let's have fair competition, but let's also reform multilateralism while we're at it and see that it works for people and not a profit-first economy, and that in fact our trading system, our global trade, is actually one that takes account of the inclusion of people and their rights and environmental standards. Those businesses, by the way, and those investors who are actually investing in business, who believe in sustainability, and I characterize the business world as divided. I have really constructive partnerships with many, many CEOs around the world, but we have such an opposition from those who want business as usual. The sad news is business as usual didn't work and won't work and will simply put people in greater contestation. Businesses that want to shift from a shareholder primacy model to a stakeholder model, some people call it many other names, responsible capitalism. We call it responsible business conduct. And we want to see a UN treaty with business and human rights. We want to see mandated due diligence, which is the primary pillar of that treaty, along with grievance procedures for remedy. And we want to see a world that respects fundamental rights, environmental standards, and shares prosperity. And you can only share prosperity if indeed we're negotiating the distribution of that. So lots of work to do on democracy, on recovery, on resilience, and we frame all of this in a social contract that people can trust. So I'm looking forward to the questions.
Great. Well, thank you so much, and thanks for giving us a lot to think about. I just wanted to remind everybody that people can ask questions in the Q&A section of Zoom, and we also have some questions that were sent in earlier, which I'll start with. A couple of weeks ago, Sharan, you mentioned the Nordic models and the Nordic social safety net as a possible model for other countries. And for the corporate accountability movement, what are the kinds of things you think we could do to build political momentum to create social floors? And specifically, as you mentioned with tripartitism, what are the kinds of things that we should be pushing companies to do to think about that? So really, how do we leverage the private sector to get a better social safety net?
So if you think about the Nordic model, but take one country in particular, they have very similar trajectories of development, but different. But if you take Sweden, it was in fact very poor in the 1890s. And they decided on a model whereby they would share prosperity. So yes, they pay higher taxes, but they would share wealth, that everybody would be looked after, and they would build collective wealth. So now they're a very wealthy country. They've just put in place a budget that is all about people. It's about health, it's about public housing, it's about public services, and their whole industrial base is built on negotiation between employers and workers. Now, I'm not going to tell you that's always, sort of hugs and kisses. It's simply not. It's actually pretty robust industrial negotiation going on right now, in fact. But what happens when that's resolved is that's the base that government respects. It's the base of their economy, and it's the base of shared prosperity, which again continues to build the economy. There are cracks in the Nordic model, but they're coming because that model's being undermined by the dominant corporate models from outside that are trying to impose, indeed, a profit at any cost approach, shareholder primacy. And of course, that plays into the legal fiduciary responsibilities, which we've fought against for decades. But if you go to then beyond the Nordic model, and how do we deploy those principles? They're actually enshrined in global law, social dialogue, tripartitism. That's been the basis of the social contract that was built through a global rule of law. Just over 100 years ago, the ILO sat down, the ILO was born, and it was born of people who sat down coming out of World War I, actually, saying we cannot have people feeling so insecure. We have to put a global floor of the social dimension in place that people can feel secure about. And that's just simply broken down, because the trickle-down theory of economics was that if you made all this money up here, it would trickle down to everybody else. Well, we know the story of that. It's nonsense. It hasn't happened, and you have an age of anger railing against globalization. So taking those principles, what you can do is actually say to companies and to investors, you know, investors should be demanding the due diligence we demand of companies, and we don't just tell them to do it by themselves. There are very good models in some of the major corporations where they're working with our global unions to identify where those risks of violations are. If you look at our global rights index, it'll tell you which countries that workers are liable to be at risk in. And if corporations don't take responsibility for human and labor rights beyond the rule of law in that country, they will be at risk of violating, you know, workers or exposing them to exploitation. But if we know where the risk is, if the supply chains are transparent, if unions are working with them, not just to identify, but to solve the problems, to effect remedy, and then monitor the health of supply chains. And frankly, we will have to shorten supply chains anyway, because technology is already driving a very different model. And it's only those companies who are saying, we are going to produce for the domestic market. So we might produce globally, but we'll produce locally for the local market. And where we have crossover, then we'll map our supply chains in a global sense, that already are starting to build a resilience frame, because they're mapping out what technology will do, how it will affect their markets, but how it will affect their supply chains. So many are simply not doing that. There's still a just-in-time mentality that is appalling, because it's just in time for manufacturing and production, but it's just in time for workers and just in time for business, and nobody wins out of that sort of level of insecurity. So we have a lot to do, but where you can really help is pushing that the stakeholders must be at the table. Workers must be at the table with business. Investors should be asking key questions around due diligence, both on labour and environment. And then we can start to see a very different world. You can also support a universal social protection fund for the poorest countries and look at how we build that fund. And that will put a model of survivability, but also a basic economy under not just those countries, but a global economic frame. And you can also absolutely demand that, you know, business has as much to gain from a new social contract as labor.
No, thank you for that. And I have a follow-up question from the audience. One is there in your discussions with companies, are you seeing any kind of critical mass or leadership from companies or executives who realize that we need a more just social safety net or more social protection? And second, are there new tools or tactics you're seeing that are more effective at getting these actors to the table?
On the first one, definitely. You know, we have a commitment from the major global associations, the ICC, the IOE, and other groups around a social protection, universal social protection. And we have support in principle for a social protection fund. We have support for debt relief. We had support for special drawing rights that would enable rich countries to allow liquidity swaps to help development in poorer countries. It was a shock to me to hear the other day, and I usually understand the foundations of the financial flows, that only 0.04% of ODA was actually going to social protection in the poorest countries. So when we contribute to development in poorer countries, our countries were only collectively in the OECD countries putting 0.04 into that. Now, just an increase in current funding, alone increased funding, would make a big difference. And then, of course, you've got, you know, the belief that we have to change beliefs. We have to say if people don't have fundamental security, then you can't have a stable economy. It's that simple. If people are excluded, you're going to have all sorts of divisions. And of course, we're seeing that collective, the global demand was already going like that, but it's now, you know, totally flat. And if you go back to the basis of business and why this is important, if you think about the fact that when hyperglobalization started to started to really hack at the social contract, if you track from the late 80s down to today, even though the world's 3 times richer in GDP terms, labor income shares like a slippery dip. It just goes like a big roller coaster. And so if people don't have money in their pockets, then they can't actually build, you know, an economy because demand is not there. And of course we get personal debt and all the other frailties that come with the cracks in our economy. But I read a statistic last week in Time magazine, actually, that showed you this much more dramatically than I can. It said that in 3 decades, $50 trillion had actually been taken out of the pockets of working Americans, just one country, because of, again, the, you know, all profits to shareholders and to the 1%. We know the story. And that's not a basis of resilience for anybody, the rich, certainly not the poor, but not business either, or banks or governments, or so we're actually seeing a breakdown in democracy. So, you know, that explains really the work we have to do together to actually rethink our world, to take the best of our business models, to put the fundamental rights and protections in place. But we can't go on like this. And I think the figure stands at 500 million jobs lost already in the formal sector. And in the US alone, of course, it's more than the jobs lost in the Great Depression already. So this is a pretty bleak future unless we do something to rebuild it.
Thanks so much for that. I wanted to shift gears a little bit and follow up with another question that was sent in, and it has to do with automation. So we have at Human Rights Watch a report coming out in the next few days about how the UK's automated welfare system and its rigid algorithms have really hurt some of the most vulnerable people. And I just wanted to ask, from your perspective, how is the global trade union movement dealing with automation to get workers out of work, but also to change the social safety net in ways that may not actually be helpful for the most vulnerable?
Well, you know, automation is not new. It's just much faster. I mean, if you look at the trajectory of industrial transformation, and not all of it's been just, of course, but if you look at it, then you've seen automation, technology, you know, change the face of business. I mean, for what, you know, 50 years that we can easily think about. I mean, when I was growing up as a child, we had telephone services where they were great jobs in rural Australia, because if you got a job as a woman, particularly in a telephone exchange, you had a secure job. It was, you know, you could train to do it, and now they don't exist. And that's the same with a whole lot of the industries exist. This is the point I make, that you still will have, even going forward, you'll have energy, manufacturing, agriculture, construction, retail, services, you name an industry, it will exist. Will the functions and the occupational base be different? Probably. But what we need to do is make sure that that shift in technology is just. And of course, some of the issues around the use of algorithms have been appalling. You're absolutely right. I mean, facial recognition, for example, I think it goes white men, white woman, black men, black women, and so on, you know. And so the risk of people simply not being able to be identified, even if you thought that was a good idea. But the whole question now of our world of surveillance, privacy erosion, you know, what it is that we want from you know, online or algorithmic driven services is up for discussion, should be up for discussion. It's a healthy thing to say, you know, we can use technology to drive a just outcome for the future, but technology isn't, it's not, we don't have to accept technological determinism. That's just ridiculous. Because if the technology is there, do we use it or don't we use it? Let's have the democratic debates about that. But there is a big issue for workers now, and it has to be part of that new social contract, that we actually see regulation to prevent surveillance and to ensure privacy. And I can tell you again from our recent global polls that one of the things that worries people most, apart from jobs and climate and health and so on, is in fact, you know, online, the loss of privacy online.
No, thank you. And I wanted to, following up with more questions, talk about the new social contract that you had proposed previously. And one of the things that we grapple with broadly dealing with companies is corporate capture of government, corporate capture of the economy and elsewhere. And how would you see effective tools or ways to combat that in order to further a new social safety net?
Well, again, if government is driven by lobby groups, and if corporations have the money to provide the biggest lobby voice, and you've seen the graphs, all of you, about how much money is spent in lobbying in, you know, most major economies versus how much access civil society and unions have, then it's not hard to understand why corporate capture, whether it's right, left, centre parties, whatever, they've all fallen for the notion that you have to drive economies on foreign direct investment, on capital budgets, you know, etc. So, and we've seen the disasters of that. So again, I will come back to the very start and say, in a world where people resolve the issues at a table, a dialogue table, and you come to agreement, then actually governments who are going to be trusted by the people will listen to that. If they're only listening to the corporate lobby, then our world will continue to be as it is, and we will see democracies break down, more conflict, civil, national, etc. So we've got to make some choices, and Human Rights Watch is one of our most valuable allies around the world on these questions. You know, every time there's a rights violation, you're there. But we need to also say, well, that's the foundations of showing the cracks in our world. But now we have to coalesce around solutions. And that's why your work on corporate accountability, but also your partnership in driving the elements that civil society sees in a new social contract is so important. I mean, we didn't talk about migrants yet, but when I look at the picture for migrant workers around the world, apart from the incredible racial divisions that we're seeing emerge once again, this awful xenophobia, which has never, by the way, created a society anywhere that we would all feel good about. So, you know, unless we actually say that we need a labour floor, a labour protection floor for every worker, whether they're, you know, workers in corporations or workers in, you know, small to medium enterprise, then we're not going to get past that, because unless there's equal treatment for everybody, then we will be subjecting people to a future that is just without hope.
So we know, say in the US, that after the Depression and after World War II, one of the key drivers in reducing income inequality and shared prosperity was the trade union movement and the vibrancy of it. And that's true in other parts of the world. So today, in the middle of the crisis, if we look in the future towards a more just social safety net and frankly, a more just workplace, where do you see the big opportunities for unions to gain more members in terms of industries or sectors or the like? And how can the corporate accountability movement promote more freedom of association around the world or in the wake of this crisis?
Well, first of all, our Global Rights Index shows you that civic space is being eroded everywhere, that freedom of association is under attack, and it's under attack from not just, countries like India, but in the US, everywhere around the world, Brazil, Colombia, Chile. You have a look at any country and you'll see some form of constraint on freedom of association emerging. And again, that's part of that corporate capture model that you talked about, the politics of the far right. You can put all sorts of labels on it, but in the end, it's a growing authoritarianism that's trying to control people rather than give people the freedom to have a voice and to come to collective solutions. We're not worried about people supporting unions. There's no lack of support. You just saw a poll in the US. We've done polls around the world. Unions come up with 70% on average support everywhere. Because again, what you said is true, that when the unions act collectively for income or social protection or, justice in governance, then usually people want that. The constraints are the business model. So if you're breaking down that global labor force model where you've got more and more people in informality, and whether it's modern business models of internet mediated or traditional development models, but where people don't have a floor of rights and where they don't feel free to actually be seen to engage freely with unions, then of course you have problems. The real issue though is not about collectivism, because I'm very confident, that people will still have a collective spirit in their own and their children's interests. The real problem is whether we're going to see that reflected in our democracies. And it does start with a challenge to corporations. I would say, which corporation is going to be better off in an authoritarian or a fascist government? Truth is none. Most of these corporations were, their predecessors were actually fighters for civil liberties, because it involves the corporate freedoms as well. Where the breakdown occurred is when they thought they could do it themselves. And they didn't need to engage with trade unions, because that's really tough. And it is difficult. Like, discussions between anybody to find a consensus is difficult. The answer is, once you've got an agreement, it's our job to manage it jointly, to see that it's respected, and to hold governments to account where they're in the mix. So the answer is, inclusivity from the base of the design forward. Everybody who must be at the table must be at the table. And then, trade unions, well, we have to pivot our world, and we're doing so in many parts of the world very well, in other parts not so well, to communicating with people. I heard a great line from a trade unionist last week who said, you know what, we've been growing in leaps and bounds because we actually use technology to listen to members about how they wanted us to communicate with them. I just smiled because I thought it's organising 101. But here you had a trade union leader who realised technology could work for them. But I'd leave you with this thought. If you look at what responses unions drove from governments and employers in the face of COVID-19, you saw access to health in many parts of the world we'd never seen. You saw job protection and therefore income protection breaking down now because it's gone on for so long, but still a fight to continue it. And the unions will fight that on the front lines. You saw social protection, new areas of social protection that we'd never seen. And so when you look at all of that, and some of the things that we can carry into the future, not just to maintain those as part of social protection guarantees, but the issues that particularly have come out of Germany and Austria and other places about maximising working time, but accepting that it will have some reduction, and maximising or maintaining maximum hours of work, I should say, and maximising income. So if you're guaranteed 80% of your working hours, but you have a reduction of 5 or 7 or 8%, and what's the government share in your income, that's a way of sharing work for the future. Because if we don't if we don't go back to full employment, just wages and social protection as a base of building resilient economies, then we're all in deep trouble.
No, thank you. And I just wanted to let the audience know we have about 5 more minutes of questions. So if people have questions, feel free to put them in the question box. I have one more, Sharan, and it really goes back to about 100 years ago. We know historically that a key factor in creating a more progressive social safety net or giving workers more voice was the breakup of trust, Standard Oil, the banking trust, and others. Paradoxically, some of these companies are bigger today than they were 100 years ago.
Exactly.
But technology companies, Facebook, Google, Amazon, and others, are the new trusts. And people talk a lot about breaking them up and what the impact would be. Could you talk a little bit about the global trade unions movement on what to do about big tech and from a trust perspective?
It's a pretty simple, kind of set of demands, really. I mean, we characterize it with a target on Amazon saying break up Amazon, but in fact, it's not just Amazon, it's all the FANGs or whatever you want to call the big tech companies. They've got so big that their power is pretty much individually, let alone collectively, bigger than the major corporates that you talked about that we've been fighting for decades. And in terms of lobby power, governments are willing to hand them money for nothing, really, because they're not going to walk away from an online market, whether they base, their business warehouse or whatever in one country or another. Most of those jobs are substandard. But it goes back to, again, the breakdown in multilateralism, because nationally and internationally, as a young worker and trade unionist, competition policy was a religion, or in the US, antitrust policy. And trade unions often fought against it because it would actually break down some unionized workplaces. But it was seen by everybody as a fair competition flaw. And I remember even supporting the negotiations for small agricultural companies in my own country to be able to bargain collectively with the major supermarkets in terms of getting fair space, because they'd play one off against the other. So collective bargaining got them an equal treatment as a flaw. But whatever the reason, it was a religion. It was just this huge religious base of, you didn't challenge it unless you wanted to. And I still hear US companies and unions sometimes say to me, oh, but that'd be antitrust. And I go, well, yeah, but, change the laws. So now, though, even though that history's there, you find me somewhere in regard to the big tech companies, any country, any kind of court that is actually demanding these companies be broken up because they're anti-competition. They're actually breaking down fair competition. So we say, break them up, make sure they pay taxes. We need new digital taxes. We still have unfinished business on financial transaction taxes, but you could bring those together potentially. And we need new wealth taxes. Oxfam calls it the billionaires tax. Well, why not? At some point, you cannot spend that money. So why aren't we actually committed to shared prosperity? I often say, if a business can only exist on exploitation, it shouldn't exist at all, because that's not the basis of a healthy, sustainable economy. And I would say the same thing about wealth. Why do we build wealth if we're not prepared to share it? So together with Human Rights Watch, with other civil society groups, and with the trade unions, we have to fight, and this is a fight for the generations. This is not just a fight for a generation looking for, just wages, although that's part of it. It's a fight for the generations and of the generations about what kind of future we want. And we certainly don't want the corporate model that too many people still want to pursue. But there are businesses who will stand with us, and we have to make sure they grow, not diminish.
So thank you for that. And true to form, right at the end, we got 2 quick questions. So I will ask you, if you don't mind for staying a few minutes, I'll put them together. The first question is, what do you see about the prospects for the Business and Human Rights Treaty? And second, could you talk a little bit about ITUC's view of the concept of circular economies and how that might?
Sure. So on the first, it's very simple. We want to see the UN treaty. The biggest obstacle ultimately will probably be the US, who doesn't like treaties, but let's see. You know, if we don't have the US human and business rights are simply about the way we reshape what was always a responsibility in that global social protection floor, where you identify risk due diligence, you do it in finance, you do it hopefully with environment, you must do it with human and labour rights. Then you put the grievance procedures. That's the case in any good industrial or civil, you know, area of law. You have grievance procedures, even if they're informal. That means unions can do their job amongst others and resolve it, and then you monitor it. So getting that global treaty to regulate business through a convention is important. But we're not even waiting for that. We're absolutely working there, you know, in every negotiation. We're there with a global union movement position. We've just actually finalised our last one this week on the new draft. But we are also demanding mandated due diligence, every country. We set a target of 5 European countries last year. We've advanced on that. We've seen France, we've seen some small sections. Dutch actually regulated child labour and due diligence in that regard, and they've got covenants in other areas. We need them all mandated. Finland, Germany, and one other have legislation in their parliaments or have announced it's in discussion. But the big ticket is that the EU has actually said that they will have a directive on due diligence. Now, once that happens, it's like anything, carbon border adjustment taxes or any other form of investment, that will change the trading base. Because if you want to trade in and out of Europe and you're not a company doing due diligence, it will give us a legal base to challenge that. And civil society, as we would hope, as we've seen, joining together with civil society, we saw the French vigilance law, and now we're actually with our global unions and civil society challenging companies under the French law who aren't in fact doing due diligence. We also want to see sanctions, by the way. I mean, it's time to forget to end soft law, you know, kind of optimism. We need to see that people who constantly, you know, base their business model on dehumanizing exploitations, and any of you who've walked the supply chains like I have, that's exactly what the model is. This has to go.
Thank you so much. We have reached the end of our time, and I'm sure there are many more things we could discuss, but I just wanted to thank you on behalf of ICAR and all the participants for taking the time to talk to us. It's given us a lot to think about, and the perspectives of you and the trade union movement are just invaluable in thinking through how we navigate this period. So I just wanted to thank you again, and then turn it over to Jenna for the rest of the day. So
thank you, Aaron. And for the person who asked about circular economy, love to talk, give them our email. We can respond offline. But thank you for the work you do. We really appreciate it.
Great, thank you.